Before Lena came into the picture, my life was steady, if a little predictable. At 29, I had settled into a stable role at a graphic design firm. My days were a blur of creative briefs, looming deadlines, and late nights kept alive by takeout and too much coffee. I lived alone in a modest apartment just outside downtown Cincinnati. It was more functional than cozy, just a place to crash, really. Socially, I didn't have much going on. A drink now and then with coworkers, the occasional Bengals game with Tyler, my college roommate. I hadn't dated seriously in years, still a little bruised from a breakup that had left more of a mark than I cared to admit. Then one evening in June, my mom called and insisted I come to a family barbecue. I agreed, mostly to avoid the guilt trip, though I dreaded the inevitable questions about when I was finally going to settle down. To my surprise, the barbecue wasn't as painful as I'd expected. My cousin Rachel introduced me to Erin, her best friend's younger sister. Erin was fun, upbeat, and easy to talk to. For a moment, I let myself believe she might be the one to pull me out of my dating slump. We gave it a shot for a few months, but in the end, we realized we were better as friends. Still, meeting her woke something up in me. I started putting myself out there again, dating apps, social mixers, even a few blind dates arranged by overly enthusiastic coworkers. But no matter how lovely the women were, I never felt that spark. Eventually, I slipped back into old habits. It started to feel easier to be alone than to keep chasing something that didn't seem real. Still, a small part of me couldn't let go of the idea that someone was out there. Waiting. Watching. I just didn't know how close that someone already was. The night I met Lena felt unremarkable at first. I'd stopped by the grocery store after work to grab the essentials, milk, bread, and a frozen pizza. I was lingering in the tea aisle, debating whether to try something new, when a voice cut through my thoughts. "Excuse me," she said. "Could you help me grab that box up there?" I turned to see her, petite, with jet black hair and a smile that instantly made the rest of the world fade out. She looked familiar, but I couldn't quite place her. I handed her the tea, and we started chatting. She joked about being vertically challenged and teased me for looking so serious while picking out tea. Before we went our separate ways, she handed me her number, scribbled on the back of a receipt. I couldn't stop smiling as I walked to my car. There was something magnetic about her, like she'd been dropped into my life by fate. Our first date felt like something out of a movie. A tiny Italian bistro, too much wine, and stories shared between laughs. By the end of the night, I was already thinking about our next. Still, something about her seemed oddly familiar. It wasn't until a few months later that I found out why. Lena eventually confessed, during what I thought was an intimate, honest moment, that she had planned our accidental meeting. She'd seen me at that grocery store before. She waited, watched, and chose her moment. At the time, I saw it as bold and flattering. Looking back, it was my first warning sign. But hindsight has a cruel way of making fools of us all. What I didn't realize then was how deeply Lena and her sisters would wrap themselves into my life. You might say I was naive, too trusting. Maybe that's true, but I loved my wife. I trusted her, and I never imagined that someone I gave 8 years of my life to could be so manipulative, so calculated. From the beginning, Lena's sisters were always around. It wasn't optional. They were a package deal. Identical triplets. It was unnerving at times. 3 women with the same face, same voice, same body. Like walking into a glitch in the Matrix. That night at the grocery store, it wasn't just Lena's idea. Her sisters helped plan the whole thing. Lena had watched me from the produce section, waiting for the right time to stage the encounter. She stood 5 feet 7 inches, with a curvy, seductive figure and that short jet black hair that framed her face so perfectly. I'm 6 feet tall, so her asking for help didn't seem unusual. But the truth? She never needed help. She just needed an excuse. She told me everything after we slept together for the first time. It was supposed to be a sweet confession, but even then, something about the way she said it felt off. Like she was proud of the manipulation. Our early dates were picture perfect, strolling through parks, feeding ducks, late-night takeout on the couch. We even held hands through an embarrassingly cheesy rom-com. It all felt too good to be true. And in hindsight, it was. Lena was impossible to ignore, funny, sexy, a little reckless. Her smile could disarm anyone, and she knew it. She used it like a weapon, soft, charming, calculated. The weirdest moment came the first time I visited her apartment. I rang the bell, and someone who looked exactly like her answered the door. "Hi, you must be Ethan," she said with the same flawless smile. I froze. "Wait, you're not Lena." With a smirk, she said, "Nope. I'm Zoe. Didn't she tell you we're triplets?" I shook my head. "Not really. She does that sometimes," Zoe said, laughing. "Loves messing with people." She invited me in, and sure enough, another Lena clone was lounging on the couch. Claire. Same look, same voice, same eerie charm. I tried to act cool, but my brain was still buffering. Finally, the real Lena appeared, all grins and playful energy. "Hey, Ethan," she said. "Want some herbal tea?" That night over dinner, we talked about everything. But I couldn't stop wondering, what was it like to grow up with two identical copies of yourself? More importantly, what kind of woman uses her sisters to test a man like that? Curious one evening, I asked Lena what it was like seeing two carbon copies of herself every day. Were they closer than most siblings? Did they ever swap places to mess with people? She laughed and nodded, clearly proud of their antics over the years. "When we were kids," she said with a sly grin, "even our own parents couldn't tell us apart. We used to switch places constantly, especially when one of us was in trouble." She told me how Claire, facing punishment, would sometimes beg her to take the fall. Apparently, their dad nearly lost his mind trying to keep them straight. Lena seemed to revel in the memory. Another time, she casually shared a story about pretending to be Claire on a first date when Claire had the flu. The kicker? Claire kept dating the guy afterward. He never found out. At the time, I laughed along. I thought it was all harmless fun, a quirky sibling thing. But in hindsight, it was a clear sign of how easily they could deceive and how comfortable they were doing it. After college, all three sisters returned to Cincinnati and rented a shared apartment. That's where I properly met Claire and Zoe for the first time. They weren't just close, they were inseparable. Fast forward 8 years, and Lena and I were married, living what I thought was the dream. I was thriving at my design firm, and we'd bought a comfortable 3-bedroom house in Oakley Square, just minutes from the city. Naturally, her sisters were never far. Claire had married Daniel, a quiet, forgettable guy from finance, and they moved into the house directly next door. Zoe married Greg, to everyone, a loud, cigar-chomping bowling alley owner with an inappropriate sense of humor and a heart of gold. They settled into the house just behind us on Oak Park Place. It was like a triplet compound. Lena and her sisters were constantly together. Most nights ended with all three in one of our kitchens, gossiping, laughing, drinking wine. Even after years, it was still nearly impossible to tell them apart at a glance. Daniel, Greg, and I had to rely on tiny clues, necklaces, outfits, voice inflection, just to keep things straight. And still, that eerie sisterly bond? It would be my undoing. Back then, though, I didn't see it. I was just happy. I thought I'd won the lottery, married to the woman I adored, part of a lively extended family, and building a good life. I was devoted to Lena, completely blind to the manipulation creeping in around the edges. Spending holidays with her parents, Helen and Frank, made it clear that even they had trouble telling the girls apart. But looks were where the similarities ended. Claire was the stiff one, reserved, traditional, always judging quietly from the corner. Zoe was wild. She loved dirty jokes and strong drinks, and if someone told me she used to dance on a bar for money, I wouldn't have been shocked. Lena, on the surface, seemed like the sweet spot between the two, charming, social, but still grounded. I thought she was the perfect blend. But here's the thing. When you're with three people who look identical and are perfectly willing to swap roles for fun, there's always that lingering doubt. You can never be fully sure who you're dealing with. Despite that, back in those early years, things felt good. We vacationed every summer, the 6 of us. Vegas, the Outer Banks, even a wild trip to Italy. It was always the same. Lena and her sisters insisted on group vacations, and the husbands learned to tag along. Still, I had one non-negotiable. I wanted 1 week every year, just Lena and me. No triplets, no husbands, no shared schedules. Just us. That didn't go over well. Lena acted like I'd asked her to betray her family. We fought about it constantly. She couldn't fathom doing something without Claire and Zoe. It took 3 years of calmly, repeatedly explaining why we needed time alone, for her to finally give in. "I love your sisters," I told her, probably a dozen times. "I like hanging with Greg and Daniel. But I married you. I need time with just you." That's not unreasonable. Eventually, I laid it out clearly. We'd continue the 2-week group trips every year, but I got 1 week with her alone. No exceptions. Simple. Fair. Logical. The final push came right before our Italy trip. She came home from work and noticed I hadn't packed a thing. That kicked off yet another argument, shouting, phone calls to her sisters, all the usual drama. I stood my ground. Calm but firm. I'm not going, I said, unless we book a week for just us. Lena lost it. Hours of yelling, pacing, emotional manipulation. But in the end, she gave in. The first few days in Italy were frosty. Claire and Zoe treated me like the villain who had torn their holy trinity apart. But Greg and Daniel, bless them, secretly thanked me. Mawan gave them bargaining power too. By day 5, Florence worked its charm. Lena thought. We laughed, kissed, got lost in alleyways, and had one of the most memorable trips of our lives. That winter, we spent a romantic week on Sanibel Island, just us. After that, the new rhythm stuck. 2 weeks with the group, 1 week for ourselves. It finally felt like balance. Until everything shifted again. It started the moment we agreed to try for a baby. We'd always talked about kids, but in that vague, someday kind of way. We were enjoying our life. The freedom, the intimacy, the quiet. But then came 30. Lena and her sisters hit that milestone like a brick wall. Suddenly, biological clocks were ticking in unison. Lena stopped taking birth control without much discussion. Within a few months, we were trying for real. Not that I minded. The process of trying was enjoyable. Our sex life had always been deeply satisfying, tender, connected, and occasionally adventurous. We had our rhythm, our little rituals. We knew each other's moves, what worked, what didn't. But then Lena's behavior started to shift. Out of nowhere, she'd show up to bed with this electric energy, aggressive, dominant, almost desperate. Those nights were wild. Long, sweaty, intense. At the time, I chalked it up to hormones or baby fever. But later, those moments would haunt me. There was something in her eyes on those nights. Something calculated. And I should have asked more questions. Special occasions with Lena often involved champagne, and when they did, her excitement turned electric. These nights didn't happen often, but when they did, they were unforgettable. One particular Saturday night still lingers in my memory. I'd just come back from a grocery run when I found Lena sprawled across our bed, completely naked, holding a bottle of massage oil. Feeling stressed today, she said with a sultry smile. Think you can help me out, cowboy? What followed was one of the most intimate nights of our marriage. I massaged her until she melted under my hands, then brought her to climax more times than I could count. Afterward, we spent hours wrapped in each other, occasionally pausing while Lena grabbed snacks from the kitchen, still glowing, still playful. In the warm haze of that night, I made a joke I thought was harmless. Wow, that was something else. Or maybe you're not Lena. Maybe I just got lucky with Claire or Zoe tonight. I expected a laugh. Instead, the air went cold. That's not funny, Ethan, she snapped. You really think I'd share you with my sisters? I tried to laugh it off. Of course not. I was kidding. But she pulled away, wrapped herself in a robe, and locked herself in the bathroom. The rest of the night was tense. The next day was no better, short replies, cold glances. I apologized again at dinner, assuring her it was just a dumb joke. She eventually let me hold her in bed, but I took note. Jokes about her sisters were officially off limits. Still, her overreaction stuck with me. Especially because, early in our relationship, she'd shared a story about standing in for Claire on a date back in high school. At the time, it seemed harmless, even cute. There was also that exchange before our wedding. We'd been teasing each other about honeymoon destinations. I preferred one place, she wanted another. I joked, maybe I'll just marry one of your sisters if you keep being so stubborn. Without missing a beat, she smirked and said, good luck. Claire and Zoe already know about your snoring. You're stuck with me. We both laughed. I responded, if they don't want me, I guess I'll settle for you. Light teasing. That was it. So why, years later, did the same kind of joke trigger such a harsh response? At the time, I didn't dwell on it. We were focused on something bigger, starting a family. We'd always talked about having kids one day, but never with urgency. We loved our freedom, travel, quiet dinners, sleeping in. But when Lena turned 30, that changed. She stopped taking birth control without much discussion, and suddenly we were trying. At first, it was exciting. Our sex life had always been strong, and now there was purpose behind it. But as each month passed with no positive result, Lena grew anxious. 10 months in, she asked me to get tested. I wasn't worried. A lot of couples take time. I agreed, even though the idea of it wasn't pleasant. The clinic room was sterile, clinical, just me, a cup, and a few outdated magazines. A few days later, I got a call from Dr. Rindle at work. I stepped into my office, closed the door, and listened. Ethan, he said, your sperm count is slightly below average, around 70% of what we'd expect for your age. But the ones you do have are strong and healthy. It might take longer than usual, but you and Lena should be able to conceive. Relieved, I planned to tell Lena that night. But dinner turned into a chat about local elections and zoning issues, and I completely forgot. It wasn't until I was in bed that I remembered. I headed downstairs to find her, figured I'd interrupt her usual late-night chat with Claire and Zoe. As I reached the living room, I heard laughter coming from the kitchen, high-pitched, carefree. I paused, not wanting to interrupt. I lingered near the door, curious. Claire's voice rang out. If he's not your favorite, then why do you always try to switch nights with me? Laughter. Then Zoe chimed in. I didn't say Greg wasn't great. I just said he's not as good at, certain things as Ethan. Then came Lena's voice. You get Greg more nights than either of us. Weekends too. Stop complaining. More laughter. I stood frozen. My mind raced. What were they talking about? Then another voice, maybe Claire, said, it's been almost a year. If Lena's not pregnant yet, it's probably Ethan. Someone else asked, so what's the backup plan? Lena answered, cool and casual. If the test results aren't good, I'll just spend a few nights with Daniel during my fertile window. The words hit me like a truck. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My wife, my partner of 8 years, was calmly discussing using her sister's husband to get pregnant. No panic. No guilt. Just logistics. Suddenly, the pieces fit. Her explosive reaction to my joke. The history of switching places. The intense loyalty between the sisters. The way she always insisted they be part of everything. And standing outside that kitchen, I realized the truth. My marriage wasn't what I thought it was. Not even close. Ethan and Daniel were similar enough. Same build, same hair color. Even the way they walked wasn't that different. It wasn't hard to imagine how someone could mistake one for the other in the dark. And apparently, that's what they were counting on. Being with Ethan every night gets a little boring anyway, Lena had said, her voice disturbingly casual. Once the window's closed, I can always go back to Greg for some fun. Then someone else, Claire or Zoe, I couldn't tell, chimed in, her tone suddenly serious. You're not getting Greg back until this is sorted. That's non-negotiable. Their laughter returned, loud and unfiltered, but I stood frozen just outside the kitchen, my body locked in place. It felt like I had wandered into some surreal, twisted dream. My wife was plotting to get pregnant by someone else. Not just anyone, but her sister's husband. And she intended to keep me in the dark the entire time. My chest tightened. Everything I believed about our relationship, our connection, our marriage, suddenly felt like a cruel, elaborate joke. I backed away slowly, retreating into the living room like a ghost. I sat there in the dark, stunned, trying to make sense of the conversation I had just overheard. Eventually, the sounds from the kitchen began to fade. Chairs scraped the floor. Cabinets closed. Footsteps approached. I rushed back to bed, slipped under the covers, and forced my body to go still. A moment later, someone crawled in beside me. Soft lips brushed against my cheek. I love you, baby, she whispered. It was Lena, or at least, I thought it was. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to say something, to call her out, demand answers. But I didn't. I just lay there, breathing evenly, pretending to sleep while my mind spun in every direction at once. Once her breathing slowed and evened out, I carefully slid out of bed. I needed to think. I needed to figure out exactly what I was dealing with. It didn't take long to realize how easy it would have been for them to pull this off. The triplets met in the kitchen nearly every night, often under the guise of a catch-up session. Swapping clothes would take seconds. A switch before bed? Practically effortless. They all worked part-time at the same interior design boutique and didn't head to work until after us husbands had already left. Switching back in the morning? Just as simple. Even weekends offered enough opportunities, barbecues, errands, visits to borrow a book or grab a catalog. They built their lives around closeness, so any interaction seemed routine. The logistics weren't what haunted me. It was the why. How could I, or any of us, have missed this? How could a man not recognize his own wife in bed? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized we'd never had a reason to question it. I never doubted the woman beside me each night was Lena. I never looked for inconsistencies because I never imagined they could exist. Still, in hindsight, there had been a shift. In the early years, Lena and I used to lie in bed and talk for hours. We'd laugh, whisper, dream together. Some nights we'd make love. Other nights we just held each other, content to connect in quiet ways. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, that faded. She began coming to bed later, always after spending time with her sisters. If I tried to talk, she'd wave me off with a tired, "Let's talk tomorrow, honey." Eventually, all our meaningful conversations shifted to earlier in the evening, over dinner or during chores. Our intimacy became surface level, reliable, predictable. And now I understood why. If the sisters were trading places, the bedroom was the riskiest place to talk. A missed detail, a forgotten story, the wrong answer to a simple question, it could all unravel in seconds. That night, while Lena slept soundly next to me, I slipped into the office and grabbed the small ink pad we used for checks. I gently pressed my finger into it, then tiptoed back to the bedroom. With a steady hand, I touched a small spot of ink just below her left shoulder blade. Tiny, no bigger than the tip of a pencil. She wouldn't feel it. She wouldn't notice it in the mirror. But I'd know. I scrubbed my hands raw afterward, making sure every trace was gone. Then I slid back into bed, heart pounding, anger building. The hurt had given way to something colder, focused. If what I heard was true, then Lena had betrayed me deeply, methodically. She had chosen deception over love. Her bond with her sisters had come before everything, even her marriage. The next day, we all gathered at Daniel's house for a barbecue. The triplets were in the kitchen prepping food. Daniel was distracted at the grill. That's when I saw my opening. I turned to Greg. "Feel like a walk around the block?" He raised an eyebrow but smiled. "Sure, why not?" Once we were out of earshot, I tried to keep my voice casual. "Mind if I ask something personal?" He glanced over, curious. "Yeah, go for it. Let's keep this between us," I said. "Not a word to the women. Or Daniel." Greg chuckled. "All right. You've got me curious now. It's a little embarrassing, but how often are you and Zoe, intimate?" He laughed, full-bellied. "Buddy, we're like clockwork. Practically every night. Maybe skip a night here and there if she's not feeling well or we're dead tired. But otherwise..." He shrugged. "We're good." He clapped me on the back, still grinning. "Sounds like you pulled the short straw, huh?" I tried to smile. But inside, something cold and sharp was settling in. Not that any of us could have known. "It's not like we got to compare notes before marrying them," Greg joked, grinning as he kicked a loose pebble off the sidewalk. I forced a weak smile, doing my best to mask the fury simmering just beneath the surface. "Yeah, I guess not. Has it always been like that?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "I mean, your routine with Zoe, since the beginning?" Greg scratched his chin, thinking. "Pretty much. We've got this rhythm. Every night, after she gets back from her sister time, she gives me this look, climbs into bed, and in her best sultry voice, says, 'Well, big boy, how do you want me tonight?' I tell her what I'm in the mood for, and we go from there." He chuckled, clearly amused by his own story. "Might sound silly, but hey, I'm not complaining." I nodded, feigning mild disappointment. "Sounds like I pulled the short straw." He laughed harder. "Guess you did." "One more thing," I said, keeping my voice even. "Lena and I used to talk a lot in bed. Late-night conversations about our future, our day, just everything. But now, it's just sleep or sex. No more talking." "Zoe liked that too." "Yeah," Greg replied, not missing a beat. "Same thing. I think the girls save the deep stuff for earlier in the day. Doesn't bug me. By bedtime, we're either wiped out or, well, revved up." He laughed again, but I barely heard it. Every new detail tightened the knot in my stomach. My suspicions were growing louder, harder to ignore. As we walked back to the house, Greg started talking Bengals, his second great love after Zoe. I threw in the occasional, "Really?" and "No kidding," but I wasn't listening. I was stuck in a mental fog, cold and detached, even as rage simmered just under the surface. I kept it together for the rest of the day. People noticed I was quiet, maybe even distant, but I smiled when I had to, laughed when appropriate. I was determined not to tip my hand. That evening, after leaving Daniel and Claire's, I even took Lena out for Indian food, her favorite. I played the part of the loving, attentive husband. She never suspected a thing. Around 10 p.m., she slipped off for her usual sister chat in the kitchen. When she came back, we began getting ready for bed. I walked up behind her, brushing my fingers lightly over her shoulders and upper back, searching for the small ink mark I'd placed the night before. It was gone. My pulse quickened. "Game on. Whoever you are," I thought grimly, "you're not Lena. And you and your sisters are about to face the consequences." I kept my tone light. "Hey, How's that scratch on your leg? Mind if I take a look? She froze, just for a second, but I caught it. Scratch, she repeated carefully. The one you got last night after dinner. You bumped into the dishwasher, remember? She looked down at her leg, playing along. Oh, right. That. It's fine now, barely a mark. I bent down and made a show of inspecting her leg. Wow, it healed fast. Last night it looked nasty. She let out a barely audible sigh of relief as she turned away. That was all the confirmation I needed. There had been no scratch. And this wasn't Lena. A few minutes later, she joined me in bed. Hey, honey, I said, keeping my voice easy. Let's pick up where we left off last night. That was incredible. She hesitated. What do you mean? You know, I said with a grin. Last night, you came downstairs with that sparkle in your eye and said, "So, big boy, how do you want me tonight?" Then you pushed me back on the bed. You were wild. Her face tightened before she forced a smile. Of course I remember. But I'm not really feeling that energetic tonight. I nodded. No worries. We can take it slow. Just tell me those things you whispered last night. I loved hearing them. She climbed into bed and pulled me into an embrace, burying her face in my chest. Sure, baby, she murmured. Whatever you want. I gently pressed. What did you like most? She mumbled something vague. We kissed, touched. But something was off. Her body was stiff. Her rhythm wrong. Her reactions hesitant, delayed. Finally, I pulled back. Are you okay, sweetheart? You don't seem like yourself. She gave me a tight smile. I think it's the spicy food. My stomach's off. Let's keep it simple tonight, okay? I nodded. Of course, Lena. Let's just take it easy. What followed was routine. Emotionless. Mechanical. The kind of sex that happens in a long marriage when both people are just going through the motions. But afterward, as she lay beside me, I couldn't shake the feeling that a stranger had shared my bed. The next morning was Sunday. We had brunch reservations at Trentino's downtown, a favorite spot. Afterward, we planned to head to Greg and Zoe's. Over Eggs Benedict and Belgian waffles, I made sure Lena stayed close, no slipping away to warn her sisters. She was tense, I could tell, probably blaming whoever had been in my bed Friday night for screwing up the details. The tension started to crack the surface. Not even 10 seconds after the waiter took our drink orders, Lena turned sharply to Zoe. Zoe, I need to use the restroom. Can you come with me? Zoe blinked, clearly caught off guard. Sure. They disappeared into the back of the restaurant, Lena looking irritated, Zoe confused. When they returned, both looked pale and rattled. They sat quietly, fumbling with their silverware, barely following the conversation. Every now and then, they exchanged nervous glances when they thought no one was watching. Claire, cheerful and oblivious at first, eventually noticed the shift. And just like that, the cracks began to show. Claire hadn't said a word, but I could tell something was gnawing at her. She kept glancing at Lena and Zoe with increasing discomfort. A few minutes later, she leaned over to Zoe and said, "Honey, my contact lens is bugging me. Can you come help me fix it?" It was an obvious excuse, but they both stood and left. When they returned, all three sisters looked visibly rattled. No one would meet my eyes. Conversation dried up. Their laughter was gone, their smiles brittle. They knew. Or at least, they suspected that I knew. And I was loving every second of it. While the guys stayed in the living room glued to the Bengals game, the sisters disappeared again, this time into the back of the house. We didn't hear a word from them for hours. By the time we were saying our goodbyes, Zoe and Claire could barely make eye contact. They mumbled farewells, tense and awkward. My little experiment had worked. Whatever game they'd been playing, they were now scrambling to figure out how much I knew and how far I was willing to go. Dinner at home that night was silent. I forced a casual, light-hearted mood, talking about vacation ideas and making up stories from work, just to sell the illusion. Lena sat across from me, barely able to fake a smile. Her answers were short. Her body language screamed fear. She was unraveling. Later that night, around 9:15, she spoke up quietly. "Honey, I think I'll go see Zoe for a little while, okay?" I didn't look up. "Sure," I said calmly. "While you're out, I'll probably start packing my things. I'll get them loaded into the car tonight and figure out a moving truck later this week." Her entire face went white. "Wait, what? Ethan, what are you talking about?" I looked at her, dead calm. "I'm leaving. You didn't actually think I'd stay in this house with a woman who lies and cheats, did you?" Her voice cracked. "Ethan, I don't understand." "Oh, you understand," I snapped. turning toward the stairs. You just don't know what to say next. Wait, Ethan, she cried after me, her voice breaking. But I was already upstairs, pulling suitcases out of the closet. I figured she'd call in backup. I was right. 10 minutes later, Lena appeared in the doorway, mascara streaking her face. Her voice was small. Ethan, Claire and Zoe are here. Can you come downstairs and talk to us? I glanced at her. She looked utterly wrecked. For a split second, I almost pitied her. Almost. I'll be down in a minute, I said flatly. Before I left the room, I grabbed my small digital voice recorder, something I usually used for work notes, and switched it on. Then I slid it into my pocket and walked downstairs. All three sisters were at the kitchen table. Their faces were tight with nerves. I sat across from them, scanning their expressions. Well, I said. No one wanted to speak. The silence dragged on until finally, Lena cleared her throat. Ethan, you know I love you, right? I looked her dead in the eye. Sorry. Which sister are you? She flinched. I'm Lena, she snapped. I'm your wife. Oh, really? I stood up and walked behind her. No ink mark. Then I moved to Claire. There it was clear as day, just under her shoulder blade. I sat back down. Okay, I said slowly. Let's say you're Lena. Then tell me, where were you Friday night? Because your sister, I nodded toward Claire, was in my bed. They all froze. The silence was suffocating. Take your time, I said, leaning back. I'm sure there's a perfectly logical explanation for why, at minimum, two of you, and maybe all three, have taken turns sleeping with me. Lena broke down into sobs, burying her face in her hands. Claire and Zoe sat stone-faced, unable to look at me. I stood. Well, I should get back to packing. Wait, Lena gasped. Please, Ethan, just give us a chance to explain. I hesitated. I should have walked away, but I needed to hear what twisted excuse they'd cooked up. Lena was too emotional to speak, so Zoe took over. It started as a joke, she said softly, not meeting my eyes. A stupid joke. We didn't mean for it to go this far. A joke. I repeated, ice in my voice. She nodded slowly. A few weeks ago, we were talking about our marriages, joking about what we liked or didn't like. And then someone said something about switching. Just as a dare. At first, it was just talk, but then, it escalated. She looked at her sisters, then back at me. Friday night, we decided to actually do it. We swapped clothes in the kitchen. I went to Daniel. Claire went to you. Lena went to Greg. And the next day? I asked coldly. We switched again for the barbecue. I stared at them. So it was Claire in my bed. And Lena was with Greg. They nodded. I turned to Claire. How was it, Claire? How does being with me compare to being with Daniel? Her cheeks flamed. I don't know, Ethan. Oh, come on, I pressed. Was it good? Memorable? Let's relive it together. What exactly did we do? She stammered. I don't remember. You don't remember? I scoffed. It was 2 nights ago. You swapped husbands for the first time in your life, and you can't remember what happened? I asked Claire coldly. Are you suffering from amnesia? I turned back to Zoe. Nice try. But your story? It's trash. Yes, Claire was in my bed Friday night. I marked her with ink to prove it. But we didn't sleep together. And don't insult me by pretending this was some innocent one-time experiment. They all stared at me, frozen. You think I haven't figured it out? That you 3 rotate nights with Greg while I get scraps? All 3 gasped, but I wasn't finished. Don't act surprised. I know Greg gets one of you every night, while I'm lucky if Lena touches me once a week. Congratulations, you've perfected your little scheme. But I'm done. I won't play along anymore. Their stunned silence confirmed everything. I took a moment to gauge their reactions. Lena sat crumpled in her chair, sobbing. Claire and Zoe looked shell-shocked. Still, I needed to hear it, out loud. I'll give you one last chance, I said, voice like ice. Lena, I want to hear it from you. How long have you been cheating on me? With their husbands? Lena turned her tear-streaked face toward me but couldn't meet my gaze. Finally, she looked down and whispered, since Zoe and Greg's wedding. Silence fell like a hammer. Zoe spoke next. Ethan, it wasn't her idea. Claire and I pressured her. Lena quickly added, it wasn't often, Ethan. Just a couple of times a year at first. I let out a bitter laugh. At first, I repeated. And then what? Once or twice a year became monthly. Weekly. Claire's face was pale, but she nodded slowly. So let me get this straight, I continued, each word sharp and deliberate. You passed your husbands around like party favors. Is that about right, Lena? She nodded again, barely holding it together. And when did that evolve into Greg getting nightly reservations while I was stuck waiting for scraps? I asked. How often, Lena? Be honest. She whispered, once or twice a week. Wonderful, I said sarcastically, the rage now fully boiling under the surface. It was just sex, she said, voice trembling. It didn't mean anything. It had nothing to do with love, Ethan. Nothing to do with us. Oh, nothing to do with love, I repeated mockingly. And I suppose it had nothing to do with trying to get pregnant with Daniel's child, either? That hit like a thunderclap. Lena inhaled sharply. Claire and Zoe exchanged terrified glances. Ethan, that's not true, Lena insisted, stepping toward me. I stood abruptly, and she stumbled back, hitting the refrigerator. Don't touch me, I snapped. You've betrayed me in every possible way, with the help of your two scheming sisters. Go ahead. Keep swapping your husbands like collectibles. Hell, maybe find someone new to add to your rotation. I didn't wait for a response. I walked out of the kitchen, grabbed my suitcase, and slammed the door behind me. As I left, I could still hear their muffled sobs echoing down the hallway. That night, I tossed and turned in a sterile hotel bed, rage keeping sleep just out of reach. But by morning, I knew exactly what I had to do. I took the day off work. First stop, my lawyer. Then I went to the bank and closed every joint account. After that, I arranged lunch with Daniel and Greg, insisting it was urgent. Daniel even canceled a meeting. We met at a diner, slid into a booth, and I didn't waste a second. Gentlemen, I said, what I'm about to tell you might sound insane, but I promise you, it's real. Our wives, your wives, have been sleeping with each other's husbands. For years. Greg went pale. Daniel's reaction surprised me. He just nodded, solemn and still. I've had my suspicions, Daniel said quietly. Greg and I both stared at him. You knew? I asked. Daniel shrugged. I noticed things. Claire forgetting conversations we'd had the night before. Little behaviors that didn't make sense. I didn't want to accuse her without proof, so I started taking notes, tracking things. I figured if I ever had real evidence, I'd bring it to you both. I explained how I'd overheard the kitchen conversation, the ink trick, the confrontation, everything. When I mentioned the voice recorder, both men leaned forward. I recorded last night's talk, I said, placing it on the table. Go ahead. Listen for yourselves. The recording played while the two men sat in stunned silence, their faces growing darker by the minute. When it ended, no one spoke. Then Greg whispered, What now? I'm divorcing Lena, I said. There's no coming back from this. Daniel and Greg weren't sure what they were going to do yet, but we talked for hours. Oddly, it was the closest I'd ever felt to either of them. In some twisted way, our shared betrayal had bonded us. By week's end, I'd signed a lease and moved my things out of the house. I told Lena nothing. She called constantly, work, cell, even email. I blocked her, changed my number, made sure my new address was unlisted. It was over. Then Thursday, something unexpected happened. At work, my colleague Natalie noticed I wasn't myself. She pulled me aside after a meeting. You okay, Ethan? She asked gently. I hesitated. Then I told her the whole story. As I talked, her face registered shock, sympathy, and something else. A glimmer I couldn't place. She bit her lip. I'm so sorry. I shouldn't be smiling. It's not funny. Then what's with the look? I asked. She blushed. It's just. I've always thought we'd make a good couple. You're a great guy, and I've admired you for a long time. I stared at her, speechless. Natalie, funny, smart, beautiful Natalie, had noticed me all this time? And for the first time in what felt like forever, I smiled. It was something I'd always known, somewhere deep in the back of my mind. I just never let myself dwell on it. I loved Lena too much. But now? Now the idea of moving on seemed worth considering. Natalie and I talked more that day. Nothing overt. Careful glances, quiet smiles, conversations hushed enough not to attract office gossip. But by the time we parted ways, I was seeing her differently. She wasn't just a colleague anymore. She was someone who saw me. Through my lawyer, Lena begged to meet. She wanted to explain her words. I didn't think there was anything she could say that would change my mind, but I agreed. Maybe I needed to hear her excuses in person to truly close the book. We met 6 weeks after I moved out in the conference room at my lawyer's office. I got there first. When Lena walked in, she looked tired, pale, but still stunning. That part hadn't changed. She sat across from me, eyes already shining with tears. I stayed calm. So, I said flatly. How are you? Pregnant with Daniel's kid yet? Her cheeks flushed. No, Ethan, she whispered. I'm not with Daniel. Or anyone. I would never. I'd never try to get pregnant by someone else. Only you. I leaned back in the chair. That's funny, I said. Because the night I overheard your little kitchen chat, I was going to tell you what Dr. Henry said. My sperm count was low, but healthy. Strong enough. There was never any need for a backup donor. Not that it matters now. She tried to speak, but I cut her off. You've been sleeping with Greg and Daniel for years. Tears welled up in her eyes. Please, Ethan, just let me explain. Explain how guilty you feel? I snapped. Explain how much you still love me? Do you really think you feel worse than I do? She lowered her eyes. No, she whispered. I sighed. Fine. Go ahead. But don't waste time telling me it wasn't about love or how much I mean to you. I've heard that garbage already. She sniffled, her voice small. It really wasn't about love. It was. I don't know, stupid. Crazy. Something Zoe and Claire and I always did. Since high school. I blinked. What are you talking about? We've always been close, she said. Too close, maybe. We shared everything. Clothes. Stories. Secrets. Even boyfriends. Wait, I said, stunned. You mean this wasn't new? She hesitated, then nodded. Almost every guy I ever dated. We thought it made us closer. I stared at her, disgusted. I thought it would stop when I married you, she added quickly. And it did. For a while. I narrowed my eyes. Did one of your sisters sleep with me while we were dating? Her face turned scarlet. Yes. 2 or 3 times. I didn't want to. Not after I realized how serious we were getting. But it was our thing. They pushed me. I stood up, pacing. Well, I guess I passed the test, right? You married me. She said nothing. You don't get it, I continued, fury creeping into my voice. You used me. I was a pawn in your little game. Just another body to rotate in. She opened her mouth, but I kept going. Was Greg just better in bed? Is that what this was about? No, she cried. Then why? I demanded. Did you ever stop to think about how this would make me feel? Ethan, you slept with all 3 of us too, she said, almost accusingly. I didn't know that. I snapped. You absolute idiot. Don't you see the difference? I thought it was you. I thought I was sharing those moments with my wife. You 3 lied to me. Tricked me. My hands were shaking. I never agreed to some open marriage. I never consented. If I had, at least I would have known. I would have had the choice. I would have seen who I was with. But I didn't. For me, it was always you. Only you. I turned away, gripping the back of my chair. I was your husband, Lena. You should have chosen me. You should have protected our marriage. Instead, you chose your sisters. You chose sex with Greg. You even planned to have Daniel's child without telling me. She broke down, her sobs racking her whole body. Ethan, please. I don't need my sisters. I need you. I stopped at the door and looked back at her one last time. That's convenient, I said, voice cold. After everything, you finally choose me. But here's the thing, you don't get to choose anymore. I opened the door. I do. And I choose a life without the woman who lied, cheated, and made a fool of me. Goodbye, Lena. Her sobs echoed behind me as I walked out. And for the first time in what felt like years, I felt light, clean, free. A few weeks later, Natalie and I started dating. It was casual at first. But after our 3rd date, something shifted. For the first time in a long time, I realized that there were other women in the world besides Lena and her sisters. Women who didn't lie, who didn't deceive, who didn't share everything like some sick social experiment. Natalie was different, energetic, honest. Our first night together turned into a full weekend of connection and heat. It wasn't just sex, it was fun, new, liberating. I didn't know if it would lead to something serious, and that was fine. For now, it was exactly what I needed. She didn't push for more. She gave me space. And in doing so, I realized just how much I needed someone who understood that. As for the others, Greg stayed with Zoe, which didn't surprise me. He was always the favorite, and the betrayal didn't seem to shake him the way it did the rest of us. Still, he laid down new rules, strict ones. Zoe had to grow her hair out long so they couldn't swap unnoticed. He made it clear, one more betrayal and she was out, no second chances. Daniel, on the other hand, hit Claire where it hurt. He got a job offer in Chicago. Told her, I'm leaving in 3 weeks. You can come with me, and we'll try counseling. Or you can stay here with your sisters. Claire was torn, and that was the last I heard. Claire couldn't choose. She couldn't bear the thought of losing Daniel, but the idea of life without her sisters terrified her. I didn't care either way. To me, all three of them deserved exactly what they got. Good riddance. Leaving Lena, in the tangled mess of lies she wove, was the clearest decision I'd made in years. But that didn't mean it was easy. In the days that followed, I was hit with a wave of emotions: anger, grief, disbelief, and a deep, gnawing sense of loss. Because I hadn't just left a person, I'd walked away from a future. A vision I'd held onto for nearly a decade. A life I'd built with her, brick by brick, now reduced to ashes because of her betrayal. At first, I buried myself in work. My graphic design firm became my safe place. The hum of creativity was a welcome distraction, drowning out memories I didn't want to face. I started taking on more projects, working late, not because I had to, but because going home to an empty apartment felt unbearable. My coworkers noticed. They praised my dedication, mistook it for drive. I let them. Their admiration was easier to stomach than their pity. Natalie, on the other hand, became something else entirely. What began as casual conversations, light, teasing, careful, slowly turned into something more meaningful. She never pried, never pushed. Her presence was steady, her laughter soft and healing. With her, I didn't feel like a broken man. I felt like someone worth rebuilding. Still, healing wasn't a straight line. There were nights when I lay awake, haunted by the past. I'd replay every word, every lie, every moment when I should have known something was wrong. Rage would flare, sharp and blinding. Then it would give way to a cold, hollow sadness that settled in my chest like a stone. Eventually, I gave therapy a try. I resisted at first. The idea of pouring my heart out to a stranger felt foreign, even weak. But over time, it became one of the most vital pieces of my recovery. It gave me language for what I'd been through. It helped me find myself again. Daniel, Greg, and I kept in touch. Sometimes we met up for drinks. An odd friendship formed out of shared betrayal. Greg was hellbent on salvaging his marriage. He laid down new rules for Zoe, strict ones. She wasn't allowed to cut her hair anymore, so he could always tell her apart. One betrayal, he told her, and she'd be gone. Daniel took a different route. He got a job offer in Chicago and gave Claire a choice. Come with me and try counseling or stay with your sisters. Either way, I'm leaving in 3 weeks. Claire was torn. I never asked what she decided. I didn't need to know. As for me, I had no intention of ever going back. Lena's endless texts and emails sat unopened in my inbox. Her desperate pleas meant nothing. Promises of change, declarations of love, they were as hollow as her loyalty. Then, one day, I found an unexpected email from her father, Frank. It was brief. No warm greetings, no small talk. Just a direct, clipped apology. He said he was ashamed of Lena's actions and wanted to extend a formal apology on behalf of the family. It didn't comfort me. It didn't anger me, either. It felt like a formality, a last attempt to save face. I replied politely, but made my stance clear. I wanted no further contact with their family. That chapter was closed. Natalie and I continued to grow closer, though I treaded carefully. My trust, once boundless, now came with walls and limits. She understood. She never asked for more than I could give. One rainy evening, over takeout and wine, she looked at me and asked gently, "Do you think you'll ever be able to love again?" Her question hung in the air for a long moment. My answer was honest. I want to. I really do. But it's going to take time. Time did its work. The months passed, and I slowly rebuilt my life, not just the routine, but the parts of me that had been chipped away. I moved into a new apartment, one filled with color and light, with art on the walls and space to breathe. A place that felt like mine. My friendships deepened. My boundaries strengthened. I even reconnected with Tyler, my old college roommate, who reminded me that love isn't always romantic. It can also be laughter, shared stories, and years of friendship. By the time Lena's name stopped stinging, Natalie and I had become something real. She wasn't a rebound. She wasn't a replacement. She was my partner. She stood beside me not in spite of my past, but because she understood it. Because she respected it. Our love wasn't flashy or dramatic. It was steady, safe, and maybe that's what I needed all along. Looking back, I can see my time with Lena for what it was, a painful, chaotic, yet necessary chapter. Her betrayal taught me hard truths about trust, boundaries, and self-worth. And in the end, it gave me the strength to walk away from something that no longer served me. It also taught me something else. Life is messy, unpredictable, brutal at times, but it's also full of second chances. And this time, I intend to get it right.